I try to like match my outfit to the vibe of the custom this week, and as a result, I'm kind of giving shitty Ren Fair, but what can you do? It's kind of cute. But whatever. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. I am in a new office. I'm sure you could tell by the change of scenery and the fact that it looks like I'm coming to you live from the inside of a Hot Topic, which is exactly how I like it. But, you know, it took a little bit of time to get settled in and situated, but now that I'm here, I am very excited to show you what I made this week, so let's hop right into it.
So for this project, I've decided to use two dolls that maybe you would not expect to go together. So this is a Fresh Dolls lad, and he was very interesting to me because this doll is a grown man. Like, he is bald, he has a beard, he's ripped, and pairing with him, I'm using this Abbey Bominable doll that is a little crusty, so let's give them a new life. So to get started, I'm removing this lad's big bald head because even though I do love it, it is his body that I am more interested in. Once our lad's head is removed, I can start preparing our Abbey Bominable for her little body transplant / gender reassignment. Now, I've actually used an Abbey Bominable doll to make a male doll in the past before I started making videos on YouTube, and I think her face does lend itself really well to make a more masculine character, and I think it's fun to really transform a doll completely from what the original vision was. After I'm done scraping out the inside of her head with a screwdriver, I'm able to cut open a slit in the back of her head to pull out the remaining hair and glue chunks from the inside. Once her head is nice and empty, I'm able to remove her face with 100% acetone. With all my prep work finished, things are able to start getting a little bit interesting, a little bit difficult. So obviously, the body that this Abbey head was originally on is very different than the body I am trying to put it on. So I'm trying to fit a very little neck hole around a thick ass neck. And in order to do that, at first I tried out just widening the neck hole, cutting bits of the vinyl away with an X-Acto knife, but I quickly realized I was gonna need a bit more than that. So my solution for this was doing perhaps one of the most horrific and, I don't know, like conceptually disgusting things that I've ever done for a doll customization. And I'm sure you could see here that I am splitting open the back of this Abbey head so I could fit his original head inside of her head. So there's like a little bit of a Russian nesting doll Kinder Egg surprise kind of situation happening. And I realized it'd be easier just to like wrap the Abbey head around his head with it already on his body. So that's what I did. He's wearing her face as a mask basically, but it's on and it works. I'm filling in the sort of gaps in the seams with some hot glue just to make a bit of a smoother surface when I go to put on his hair. I think this was remarkably the most successful method I've ever used for putting a monster high head on a male body, so I guess whatever works. Once the head is color matched to the rest of the body, I can call this a successful surgery. The transplant is complete. And now I can start to actually bring this character to life with his face up. So at the time I was making this fella, I was playing a lot of Baldur's Gate, gotta be so real, and I was just in the mood to make a sort of like fantasy warrior kind of vibe. And there's a certain thing I've been wanting to do for a while, which is make a character kind of inspired by the sort of avatars that my husband tends to make whenever he like plays like an RPG like video game with a character builder. Like he tends to skew towards certain design choices, and I was taking some inspiration from those. It's kind of funny that I say that because in that Baldur's Gate playthrough that we had together, his character looked nothing like this. This is more like whenever he plays an RPG for the first time, he usually likes to make his character a little inspired by himself. So this is more based on that. When I was color matching his head, there was a slight imperfection in the paint just from the way that it dried. So I decided to cover that up with a little eye scar because I thought it'd be fitting. I didn't want to make the scar the traditional just like single gash because I feel like that's a little overplayed. So I decided to extend it down to his lip as well as give it this little like offshoot to make it a little bit more of an interesting wound that could have happened here. The only way I could see this feasibly happening in like one injury is if like something reached over his head and then like clawed upwards and like peeled that little like flap open, you know, which would be really gnarly. Kind of insane for that to happen to a person and to keep your eyeball, but you know, he's not real, so I guess anything is possible in the world of art. For his eyebrows and lips, I just kept everything very natural because my man is not putting on makeup to go like fight dragons or goblins or whatever it is that he's doing with his time. That's always a very funny option to me in character builders where like it doesn't matter what your character is doing in their day. They're having the longest, sweatiest hours grinding, like gathering random herbs and like killing creatures and like rifling through dead bodies, and yet they have time to put on eyeliner and eyeshadow every morning in their little camp. Like, honestly, really slay. After everything is painted and dry, I can go ahead and go in with my chalk pastels to blush his face. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to take a quick moment to say if you watched this far and you liked this video, consider liking it. It really helps me out a lot. And if you want to see more art things from me, consider subscribing. Now that I'm settled into my new office, we should hopefully be getting things a little bit more often. And between you and me, I might start streaming soon. So if you want to see that, stick around. If you have thoughts, feelings, opinions, be nice to me in the comments below. One of the things that I do to help masculinize his face in this process is I add a little bit of shading on his forehead above his brow to kind of help bring out his brow bone a bit, just because, you know, even though Abbey has pretty strong features, I feel like he could use a little bit of chiseling, you know, help man up his face a bit. One thing that I like to do at the end of the blushing process is come through with a tiny chunk of eraser to help brighten his eyes back up. Speaking of brightening up his eyes, it's time to add his catch lights, and once those are done and dry, I can seal him in with several very watered down layers of liquid sealant. I use matte Mod Podge for this, but you can use whatever works for you. I really decided to go all in on the experimentation for this project, so here I'm taking black yarn and turning it into flocking by cutting it into teeny tiny little pieces, and I'm going to use it to give him a beard, which is something I have never done before, and it was very scary because I have this face that is finished and painted and blushed, and I like it, and if I mess this up, it will all be ruined. I'll have to start over. So it was very scary and stressful. Because this was such a daunting task, I decided to do it in little chunks at a time. So I started out with just this portion around his jaw, and I'm applying a little bit of glue with a paintbrush to try to be as careful and precise as I can. And then I'm pressing the flocking on and letting that dry, and I just worked in very small sections at a time. I was really trying to build up his jaw and his chin because Abbey has, to make her into a man, I feel like her chin is pretty weak for what I was going for, so I really wanted to help beef that out, and the flocking really helped do that. I didn't want him to just have like a little pencil beard, so I'm bringing the hair farther up his cheeks a bit to help fill that out a little bit more. This is the part of the process where the sort of husband inspiration really came in, because one thing about that man, he is very much a facial hair enjoyer. And right here, my guy is really giving woolly willy. It's kind of gross. But once that's brushed off, I'm just kind of like filling in the gaps, because I really am using the flocking to try to shape a jaw. So it's not just like one single layer on the skin. I'm trying to build a jaw with yarn, which was also, like I said, all this was very new and worrisome, but I started getting a little bit more confident as I was going on. I love how I say that, but I literally did his mustache off camera because I was so worried about messing it up and having to work around my filming setup. And it still ended up kind of uneven here, but I go through and I kind of adjust it later. Afterwards, there was so much little yarn dust everywhere, but luckily a lint roller will do the trick. Once I'm done with his facial hair, I'm able to start prepping to give him his hair. So for this, I'm using the same yarn that I use for the flocking, and I'm just cutting them into strips of relatively the same length. And I decided to just keep the yarn as is. I'm not pulling them apart or brushing them out, because I thought the sort of like long twist look would be fitting for the character. And that's another thing that Chris tends to gravitate towards in his character building is, you know, giving his characters long hair. So I thought it'd be fitting. Once I'm pretty confident in the pile of yarn strands that I have, I can start gluing them down. So for this, I'm just using more Mod Podge. It's the same that I use to glue down his beard, and I'm just gluing him down. It's it's pretty straightforward. I decided to go for this partially pushed back look, and I'm going to do something to cover up that hairline later because it's a little rough right now. Alright y'all, so strap in, because somehow this ended up being the bulk of the project. I am making a pair of pants in perhaps the most convoluted way possible. I don't know how else to explain it, but oh boy, let's get into it. This material that I'm using is the weird like fabric strap things that came with our couch when we bought it, and I cut it into strips, and I'm measuring out this piece of elastic to the size of his waist, and this is going to be his waistband. I'm sewing that up into a loop. I'm sorry. I'm laughing at myself because it's like I was trying to reinvent the wheel. I'm like, how can I make a pair of pants without making a pattern? And by using this trash. So I'm taking these straps of fabric and I'm trying to make this like kind of piecemeal, like cobbled together, like you know like Cassandra's pants in Dragon Age, or like I feel like it's a very common fantasy design thing where it's a pair of pants and it's made by like sewing together a bunch of little like pieces and strips of fabric, and I'm going for that. So I'm building this pair of pants one strip at a time, and I don't know, I just feel like it's very impractical to do it this way, but that's what I did. So to help aid me in this process, I'm using a bit of tacky glue to help get things in place before I sew them, just because I just figured it'd be easier to help lay things out like that instead of trying to like pin everything together. After I got this little like loin bit glued together, I decided to go through with some embroidery thread and add some 3D stitches to make it more apparent that I'm going for this stitched together look. And I do this at every step of the process because I figured if I waited to the end to embroider everything, it'd be way more difficult to work with. So I'm just doing, you know, standard stitch design. So after I got this first like butt piece sewed up, that was kind of the end of me knowing what I was doing. Like I had the first thought of what if I did this, and then the rest of the steps I didn't really know what I should do. I will say though, once I got like the leg pieces attached to the crotch piece, that's when I started feeling like kind of confident that I could figure out what I was doing. To fill the gaps between the other strips, I decided to use this t-shirt material and just kind of shove it in and glue it in place. I figured that this would be a little bit more flexible to work with, and if I did it while it was on his body, I would have a better idea of how much space I actually needed to fill, because it's hard to tell when the pants are off of him. After I struggle to get it tucked in for a while, I go through with a little bit of tacky glue on the end of a needle to just glue down the edges. And I know everything is real ugly right now, but I'm planning on going over everything later, so it's alright if it's a little bit messy. And there's supposed to be a little, like, you know, rough and ready, you know, like he made these pants himself on the road. So I wanted like the different textures and the different, you know, things going on. So I used the two long vertical strips that go down the leg as like an anchor point to do the horizontal strips that go across. So I built up the thighs before going through and adding the stitching to those. And this time the stitches actually do hold the strips together so they don't just like accordion apart. After that, I cut off the vertical strips going down the sides and instead moved them to the back because for more visual interest, I wanted to do these like X cross strips across the knees, and it was easier to anchor those to a strip going down the back. And as you can see, this was a pretty long process, so I moved to a more comfy workspace. And for the rest of the way down, I just did normal horizontal strips. So when I went to go do the reinforcing stitches, I ended up snapping my sewing needle in half because this material with the glue was very hard and it was very difficult to work with, but you know, what can you do? After that minor setback, I went through with the t-shirt material to fill in the gaps between the strips I had just done. And then all that was left to do was to use the embroidery thread to stitch together the remaining horizontal strips on the lower half of his legs. And then they were fully constructed. It took many days, and once it was done, I went through with some diluted black paint to help give it a nice uniform look. It was such a major relief to get to this part, and honestly, I am so proud of myself, y'all, because if you've been following this channel for a while, you know I have an aversion to making garments, especially making removable garments, and for some reason, I was so determined to make a pair of pants that you could take off. I don't know why, but I'm glad I achieved it. I do go through and add another layer of watered down paint later, but for now I'm putting that aside and worrying about his top. So this is a Wild Hearts crew shirt that turns out to fit him, and I'm using acetone to remove the little unicorn applique on the front because I felt like it did not fit the vibe. After his boobies are covered, I lay him down on a piece of construction paper to make a very rough tracing of his torso so I can make a little vest pattern piece. You can see it really is a thing of beauty. I always like to cut my pattern pieces in half, that way I can just sort of mirror them to ensure that I end up with something symmetrical. And I'm cutting out a back piece as well as two front pieces because it's a vest. and I'm using this little piece of leather that my mom sent me in her last care box. Once all the pieces are traced out, I'm able to cut everything out and sew them together. I added another strip of leather to the vest off camera, as well as made this little headpiece for him to help cover up that tragic hairline of his. Also off camera, I made these little boots, but they kind of blend into his pants, so it's kind of giving feety pajamas a little bit, but I try to fix that later. So to spice up his little headband, I take this little diamond-shaped earring and I'm cutting the post off of it so I can use it as a little embellishment. And here's where I started my losing fight with the super glue. So I go to super glue it on, and it doesn't really work. And I managed to glue myself and the earring to each other, so that was fun. To help preserve my fingers, I went ahead and just glued it off camera. That way I could really focus. I could really lock in. I added a few more embellishments as well as lost a few more fights with the super glue. But I eventually ended up with a mostly finished outfit that I'm pretty happy with. And now he just needs one more very important accessory. Those of you who've been following my work for a while probably know that I love giving my dolls little weapons. I just think they should be able to do violence, and this guy really needed a cool sword, so that's what I'm doing. Here I'm using a toothpick for the handle, and I'm just kind of sculpting out a very rough blade shape just to get something to work with. Once that's completely dry, I go in with some scissors to trim off the very thin wobbly bits at the edges, and then I go in with sandpaper to really get the shape of the blade. This particular sword that I'm making is a very simple shape, you know, it just kind of comes to a beveled point in the center. And so this is mostly just about getting these flat planes as smooth as possible and getting everything down to an appropriate thickness and, you know, try to get it as symmetrical as I can get it with my human imperfect hands. This is what I ended up with, and for some reason it looks really delicious. I don't know what it reminds me of, but I kind of want to eat it. Next I use some hot glue to reinsert the handle into its little hole. And to continue with the handle, I'm using another toothpick to create the cross guard for the sword. Once I get the pieces down to the size I want, I tentatively attach them with some hot glue that will get reinforced later. For an embellishment, as well to add a little bit more structural stability to the crossguard section of the sword, I made this little loop out of wire and then glued it in place to sort of help hold everything together. To help beef up the handle as well as give it some grip, I'm gluing a bit of embroidery thread to the back and just wrapping it around the toothpick until I get my desired thickness. Once it's all wrapped up, I added another little circular metal embellishment to the back to cover up where the embroidery thread was glued down to the handle. I added another little metal piece to the bottom of the handle, well, not necessarily quite the bottom, but at the joining point between the handle and what will eventually be the pommel. To make the pommel, I take a little ball of clay and press it against the bottom of the handle to get the impression of it, and then I took it off to let it dry. And once it was dry, I was able to do the same thing that I did with the blade, which was just get the real shape by sanding it down. I didn't do anything crazy with the shape of this. I was basically just trying to make it look a little bit less rough and organic looking. I realized that it was really difficult to hold on to this little ball and sand it at the same time, so I went ahead and glued it on and then finished my sanding while it was attached to the sword. Once everything was constructed, I can go over everything with black paint to give a nice base for when I go over it with metallic paint. The metallic paint that I have is really old, and it already was really thin and watery to begin with, and I think it's just degrading with time, which I don't know if that's a thing that happens, but it took a lot of layers to get this even relatively where I need it to be. But will I buy new metallic paint? No, I will keep using the bad one until I run out of it. I did eventually end up with a result I was happy with, and the last thing for me to do is to add another piece of embroidery thread to give me something to use to attach this to his hand. At this point, I realized I wasn't fully happy with how his pants were looking, so I took a quick break to add some gray paint to all of the little stitches to help them stand out. And the footage I got for this isn't that great because, listen, it was the end of the project, I was feeling lazy, but you'll see how it turns out in the final results, okay? I'm sorry. I had some more filming troubles as I was trying to get footage of me attaching the sword to his hand, that way you guys can like see how I do it, and I just could not get a good angle, so I did it off camera. But with that, he's complete, and here are the final results. And y'all already know what I'm gonna say. I am so happy with how he came out. I think he looks so cool, and it was worth all the trouble and strife. But that's it for this video. I hope to see y'all next time. Love you, bye!